Out beyond the last stretch of cultivated land, where the red earth bakes under a merciless sun, there stood a half-finished corral surrounded by a scattering of fence posts and swaths of fresh-cut timber. At the center of this dusty endeavor was May Sullivan, a widow 6 months pregnant, her straw hat tied tight beneath her chin. Each morning before dawn, she rose to shoulder logs heavier than her own frame, her skirts tucked high, fingers raw from hammering nails into stubborn cedar. Since her husband's death last winter, May had eked out a living on this lonely parcel of land, raising a few head of cattle, mending fences, and dreaming of the day when her unborn child would chase calves across soft grass instead of barren scrub. Every board she set, every stake she drove, was an act of hope, proof that she could survive, that her family's legacy would endure. On this particular morning, the sky wore the pale lavender of dawn. May paused in the saddle of her mule, wiping sweat from her brow, and surveyed her work. The corral's frame took shape, 3 sides squared, the 4th awaiting her final push. Her breath came in measured exhales, slow, determined, until a distant rumble reached her ears, at first faint, then growing louder with each heartbeat. She straightened and peered toward the horizon. A wagon, its polished wheels kicking up twin trails of dust, barreled toward her. Behind it rode a lone figure on a magnificent bay stallion, tall, broad-shouldered, with a hat so wide it shadowed half his face. The man's coat gleamed in the early light, the cut of his boots and the silver bands on his reins marking him as a man of means. May's heartbeat quickened, both from fatigue and surprise. She sank from the mule and wiped her hands on her apron. The wagon pulled to a stop a dozen paces away. The stranger tipped his hat, revealing aquamarine eyes that scanned her work with unmistakable interest. "Morning, ma'am," he called, voice smooth as riverstone. "Name's Jackson Cole. I'm riding through these parts, and I noticed you've been building that corral by yourself." May swallowed, steadied herself against a post, and replied evenly, "Name's Sullivan. May Sullivan. Yes, I've managed so far." Jackson Cole dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He approached the half-built fence, fingertips grazing the fresh wood. "Quite a feat for one person," he said, a trace of admiration in his tone. His gaze flicked to the curve of her belly. "Expecting a partner to help?" May bristled at the question, but forced a wry smile. "Just me and a mule, so far." He nodded, as if she'd answered a riddle. Then he offered his hand. "Well, Miss Sullivan, if you'll have one, I happen to have a full crew of men back at my ranch, and I'm a rich man with a good heart. I'd be honored to lend you a hand on this corral." May studied him, this millionaire cowboy in fine clothes, offering help to a pregnant widow in the middle of nowhere. Pride warred with necessity in her chest. Finally, she reached out and shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Cole. I'll think on your offer." As Jackson Cole tipped his hat again and mounted his stallion, May returned to her workbench. She drove the first nail into the last upright post, the echo resonating like a promise. Tomorrow, help would arrive, and her future and that of her child would take another step toward safety and belonging. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the Ochre Mesas, May tended her small herd of cows, guiding them toward a makeshift watering trough. The air shimmered with heat, and the mule's braying echoed against distant buttes. Her muscles ached from the day's labor, but determination lit her eyes. This corral would stand, by her hands alone, if need be. Just as she finished, a rider appeared on the ridge above. Jackson Cole, silhouetted against twilight, reined in his stallion and called down, "Miss Sullivan, if you got a moment, I promised I'd return in the evening." May exchanged a glance with the mule, then lifted her chin. She walked uphill to meet him, the loose soil crunching beneath her boots. Cole dismounted and offered her a small canvas satchel. "Thought you might need some supplies before we begin tomorrow. Extra nails, rope, even fresh racked lumber if you like." He tipped the bag, revealing its contents: sturdy metal spikes, coils of hemp rope, and a stack of freshly sawn planks bound with twine. May's jaw tightened. "I appreciate it, Mr. Cole, but I've managed without. I can pay you back." His smile was patient, almost amused. "No, ma'am. Just consider it a gift from one rancher to another. I'll send my foreman and half a dozen hands at first light." She hesitated, pride writhing like a barbed wire in her chest, but she felt the flutter of life beneath her heart and thought of the days ahead, the months of raising a child alone. "All right," she said finally, voice soft but steady. "I accept, but only your help with the corral, nothing more." Cole nodded once. "Fair enough. I'll be early." He mounted and turned his horse. "Rest well, Miss Sullivan." As he rode away, May watched the flag at his saddle stir in the evening breeze, then glanced down at the satchel in her hand. She unrolled a plank from the bundle, running her palm along its smooth grain. For the first time since her husband's passing, she felt a flicker of possibility. This stranger's kindness might not be a trap, but the start of something more: security, community, perhaps even friendship. That night, by lantern light, May inspected the lumber and sorted tools, her mind racing with plans. When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of sturdy fence rails forming a stable ring, and felt in that dream the warmth of other hands working beside her. At dawn, the horizon glowed rose and gold. May crept outside to find half a dozen burly hands already at work. Cole's ranch foreman directing 2 men raising posts, another sharpening a saw, while one tied fresh rope around a rail. Jackson Cole himself stood apart, watching her with a respectful nod. May took a steadying breath, adjusted her hat, and strode forward. "Good morning," she called. "Morning, Miss Sullivan," the foreman replied. "We've got you." And as the first plank lifted into place, May realized that accepting help did not make her weak. It made her human. Together, they would finish the corral, laying down not just timber, but the foundations of new beginnings. By mid-morning, the corral had begun to take solid form. Sturdy cedar posts driven firmly into the red earth, fresh rails spanning the gaps like the ribs of a rising barn. May stood at the center, her skirts hitched above her knees, sweat darkening the fabric at her back. Around her, Jackson Cole's men labored under the sun, each movement choreographed by the foreman's brisk commands. Cole joined her at the fence's edge, wiping his own brow with the back of a gauntleted hand. He handed May a coil of rope and said quietly, "Wrap the knot twice before you cinch it. Holds better that way." May followed his instruction, her fingers working quickly. "I learned plenty about knots back home," she replied, "but I'll take all the schooling I can get." He smiled, a fleeting curve at the corner of his mouth, and nodded. "You've got the grit of a Sullivan, that's for sure." She hesitated, glancing at his polished boots and the fine cut of his jacket. "And you've got the advantage of a millionaire's wallet." she teased softly. His expression grew earnest. Money's no good without a purpose. Back home, I had a wife who dreamed of flying horses. She passed last year, left me with this and a heart full of regret. When I saw you out here alone, I remembered her dream. Build something that lasts. He gestured to the rising corral. Let me help you finish what she believed you could. May paused, heart stirring at the trace of loss in his eyes. She nodded once. Then let's build something worth dreaming of. They worked side by side until the sun reached its zenith. May drove in nails at the top rail while Cole steadied the post. Between hammer blows, they shared stories, hers of the winter that stole her husband and theirs of the runaway colt he'd once tamed. With each exchange, the distance between millionaire and widow narrowed. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the final rail was lifted into place. The corral stood complete, a perfect square of gleaming wood against the untamed prairie. May set down her hammer and ran her hand along the smooth top rail, breathless with pride. Cole paused beside her. "It's solid," he said, voice soft. "Ready for any calf you got." May looked out across the newly fenced yard and then back at him. "Thank you, Jackson. I wouldn't have finished this without you." He tipped his hat, eyes warm. "Then it's ours, May Sullivan, your corral and my promise to be here when you need me." She felt the life within her flutter, as if the child recognized the promise too. In that moment, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, she realized the corral was far more than a cattle pen. It was the first fence around a family, not built of money or brute strength, but of shared hope and the promise of a new tomorrow. Just as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the freshly built corral, May wiped her hands on her apron and prepared to ride home. Jackson Cole stood nearby, unsaddling his stallion, when the distant clip-clop of hooves drew their attention. A pair of riders emerged on the horizon, one a lean messenger in the blue livery of the county judge, the other a stern-faced deputy with a rolled parchment tucked under his arm. The messenger reined in at the corral gate. "Miss Sullivan?" he called, voice polite but urgent. May exchanged a quick glance with Jackson. "I'm May Sullivan," she replied, sliding from the saddle. The deputy unrolled the parchment and cleared his throat. "By order of Judge Barstow, you are served notice. The land upon which you stand, formerly owned by your late husband, has been claimed in back taxes. Unless payment is made within 30 days, the property reverts to the county." May's heart stalled. She pressed a gloved hand to her chest. 30 days? But I've paid every tax, and the homestead claim was granted for our work improving the land. The deputy's jaw tightened. "The judge disagrees. You may appeal, but it will take months, and the corral alone may push your debts beyond redemption." Jackson stepped forward, eyes ablaze. "This is unjust." He turned to May. "Tell me what you owe. I can cover it." May stared at the document, tears prickling her eyes. Pride warred with desperation. Could she accept his help again and risk owing her future to a man she barely knew? She looked up at Jackson's steady gaze. In his eyes, she saw not obligation, but genuine concern. With a trembling breath, she nodded. "Thank you, Jackson. I'll accept." Jackson took the parchment and, with a swift motion, wrote a line across the bottom. "Paid in full by J.C." He folded the paper, handed one copy to the deputy, and tucked the other into May's hand. "Consider this claim settled," he said. The deputy tipped his hat and spurred his horse down the trail. The messenger followed in silence. May stood clutching the stamped notice, her relief mingled with a new, deeper gratitude. Jackson reached out and gently brushed May's fingers. Your home is yours, May. No land claim or back taxes will ever change that. May pressed the stamped notice to her heart and looked into his eyes. The prairie breeze whispered around him, carrying the promise of safety and something more. In that moment, May Sullivan understood that true partnership meant sharing burdens as well as triumphs, and that in Jackson Cole she had found not just a benefactor, but the foundations of a family she could trust. As autumn's chill crept into the dawn air, May rose each morning now not just as a widow, but as a partner, side by side with Jackson, in shaping their shared future. Under Jackson's guidance, she planted a small garden beside the corral, rows of beans, squash, and corn that would feed her and her child through the lean winter months. Jackson lent her his foreman's expertise in soil rotation and even showed her how to rig a simple irrigation line from the creek below. Between the fields and the corral, they refurbished the old barn, replacing rotted beams and hauling in fresh hay. Jackson worked with quiet determination, often pausing to press a gentle hand to May's belly and murmur, "You and our baby are the harvest I most look forward to." May would smile, fishing a locket from her pocket, her husband's portrait on one side, hers on the other, and tuck it near her heart as she drove nails. One crisp afternoon, word spread through the valley that Jackson was hosting a small gathering in honor of May and her coming child. Neighbors from neighboring homesteads arrived bearing gifts of candles, yarn, and a patchwork quilt stitched with bright squares. Under a canopy of cottonwood trees, children chased each other between barrels of cider, while women shared recipes for postpartum teas and hearty stews. Jackson watched May's eyes brim with happiness. This moment, he knew, was as precious as any cattle drive he'd ever led. That evening, as lanterns glowed warm around the great barn door, May and Jackson stood before their friends. May spoke first, her voice rich with gratitude. When I was alone, this land felt endless and empty. You filled it with hope and with family. Jackson took her hand and added, Together, we'll raise this child among hard work and kindness, just as this frontier taught us. Applause rang out, and in the glow, May felt her heart become more whole than it had been in years. But frontier life was never without trials. A severe windstorm struck the valley 2 nights later, ripping canvas from the barn loft and felling a towering pine that crashed across the corral gate. May awoke to Jackson's calm voice. "Stay inside. I've got this." Before her eyes, he and 2 hired hands worked through the pre-dawn gloom, sawing away branches and retying rail supports. When May stepped out at first light, Jackson wrapped her shoulders in a warm blanket and said, "Nothing will keep us from our dreams, not even the fiercest storm." In the weeks that followed, May's belly grew round, and Jackson took over more of the outdoor chores. Each evening, he carved simple wooden toys, horses, cows, and miniature fences, for their baby's nursery. May watched him at work, marveling at the care in each smooth curve and gentle stroke. When she finally heard the first soft kick of new life, she laid her hand over Jackson's and whispered, "We did this together." As the first snow dusted the high plains, May and Jackson stood beside the corral under a sky streaked with pink and gray. The corral, the garden, the barn, all bore testament to their unity, to the promise that had begun with a single offer of help. May rested her head against Jackson's shoulder and felt, in that cold morning air, the warmth of a family built not from wealth or duty, but from shared labor, trust, and love. Winter settled over the Sullivan homestead in a hush of powdered snow, turning the corral rails and barn timbers into frosted silhouettes against a pewter sky. For May, each breath was cold but precious, the weight of new life within her pressing gently against her ribs. Jackson stoked the hearth each morning, sending warmth through the cabin's log walls, while May sipped hot herbal tea and wrapped quilts around her shoulders. One night, as wind howled like a lonely coyote beyond the window panes, May awoke with a sharp pain in her side. She gripped the bedpost, breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Before she could call out, Jackson burst through the cabin door, lantern in hand. His face, usually calm as the prairie at dawn, was etched with concern. "May," he said, voice tight, "it's time." He swept up her bundle of woolen blankets and prepared for the journey into the warm berthing room he'd built off the main cabin. Outside, snow drifted knee-deep. Jackson doubled back to fetch the two hired hands who'd agreed to see the berth through. By lantern light, they bundled May onto a sled lined with furs. Jackson walked beside her, guiding the team of horses along the packed path to the berthing room, a small adjoining space heated by a wood-burning stove and arrayed with clean linens. The hired hands carried May inside, warming her feet and placing her on a sturdy cot. Through the long, breathless hours Jackson stayed at May's side, holding her hand, murmuring words of encouragement, his own gratitude showing in every tremor of his voice. May's pain ebbed and flowed like the tide, but with each contraction she found strength in Jackson's unwavering presence. At the moment of birth, Jackson wrapped the newborn in soft swaddling cloth, tears glistening in his eyes. The hired hand stepped back respectfully as May, pale but radiant, took her son into her arms. His cry was small but fierce, a wild frontier spirit claiming its place in the world. Jackson brushed snow melt from his coat as he stepped forward. "He's perfect," he whispered, voice thick with wonder. May lifted her son so Jackson could see his tiny face, dark hair already damp at the crown. Together they named him Samuel Cole Sullivan, honoring both parents, the legacy of her late husband, and the new family they had forged. Jackson pressed May's hand to her cheek. "Welcome to our world, Samuel," he said. Outside, the wind had died to a gentle sigh, and the moon peeked through broken clouds, silver in the snow. In the quiet that followed, May and Jackson sat side by side on the cot. Samuel swaddled between them, each feeling the profound miracle of life, a child born of love, hope, and enduring partnership. By dawn's rosy glow, the corral, the barn, and even the battered fields seemed to hold their breath, awaiting the promise of spring. But for May and Jackson, and little Samuel curled against their hearts, winter had already delivered its greatest gift, the warmth of family in the vast, untamed West. Spring arrived on gentle feet, melting the last snowdrifts and coaxing green shoots from the thawed earth. Outside the cabin, May knelt by the garden she and Jackson had planted the previous autumn. Tiny bean sprouts unfurled toward the sun. Clusters of bright yellow squash blossoms dotted the dark, rich soil. Little Samuel lay in a cradle on the porch, swaddled in the patchwork quilt sewn by their neighbors, his soft coos mingling with the morning breeze. Jackson rode up on his stallion, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He dismounted and joined May at the garden's edge, brushing a lock of hair from her brow. "Thought you might like fresh eggs for breakfast," he said, tipping the sack to reveal a dozen white eggs shimmering like pearls. Samuel's eyes brightened, and May smiled. They carried the eggs inside and set a skillet on the stove. May cracked one open, letting its golden yolk pool in the hot iron, while Jackson cradled Samuel against his chest. The cabin filled with the gentle sizzle of cooking and the boys' delighted laughter as Jackson tickled his chin. After breakfast, Jackson saddled their horses for a trip to the nearest market town, a day's ride away. May tucked Samuel into a cradle strapped behind her saddle, then swung up beside Jackson. As they set out across the bloomin' prairie, wildflowers, blue lupine, red Indian paintbrush, and white yarrow painted the landscape in vibrant strokes. At the ranching co-op, neighbors greeted them like returning heroes. Jackson traded eggs and fresh vegetables for feed and tools. May collected bolts of fabric in the soft pastels for Samuel's growing wardrobe. Each handshake and kind word reminded them that, even in the vast frontier, community thrived on acts of generosity, just as their own story had begun. On the ride home, Jackson paused at a windswept bluff. He lifted Samuel so the boy could touch the distant horizon, his tiny fingers brushing the air. May rested her head against Jackson's shoulder, watching their son's awe at the endless plains. "He'll grow up knowing these wide skies," she said softly, "and that love can build a family anywhere." As dusk settled, they returned to the homestead. The corral stood proud behind them, cattle lowing softly within. The barn's new roof settled against the sky like a promise kept. Jackson led the horses to their stall, and May carried Samuel inside, laying him in his cradle by the hearth. Together, May and Jackson sat by the fire, hands entwined, watching the flames dance. Samuel drifted into sleep, his chest rising and falling with even breaths. The cabin was warm, not just from the fire, but from the certainty that they had each other, and that their family's future was as bright as the spring sun. Outside, the prairie night whispered its ancient lullaby, the rustle of grass, the call of a whippoorwill, and the promise of tomorrow. Within those walls, May, Jackson, and little Samuel found the truest corral of all, a home built not of cedar and rope, but of trust, resilience, and the enduring strength of love. Years passed under that wide western sky, and the Sullivan Ranch flourished. Little Samuel grew into sturdy legs and a fearless heart, splitting his time between the corral and his mother's garden. He chased calves across sunlit dust, his laughter mingling with the lowing herd, and learned to braid hay ropes nearly as deftly as May herself. May Sullivan, once the lone widow forging a future with hammer and nail, became the heart of a bustling homestead. Her evenings were filled with the soft murmur of Samuel's bedtime stories and Jackson's quiet praise as she balanced the books, tended the fields, and kept the ranch running like clockwork. Jackson Cole became more than the millionaire cowboy who'd ridden in on a polished stallion. He was a devoted husband, always quick with a helping hand, assistant tutor, and a steady partner in every frontier challenge. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, marked by the first light of dawn gilding the corral rails, May and Jackson stood side by side, watching Samuel lead a foal into its pen. The wooden fence, once a single corral of hope, had grown into miles of pasture, barns, and outbuildings humming with life. Jackson slipped an arm around May's shoulders and whispered, "Look what we built together." May pressed her cheek to his coat, smiling as Samuel galloped the young horse in a proud circle. "Not just the land," she replied. "We built a family, stronger than any storm, deeper than any drought." When the prairie wind stirred the tall grass, they heard the echo of their beginnings, the echo of a gifted plank, a generous act, and a promise made beneath the setting sun. In that moment, they knew the true measure of their journey was not in acres claimed or fences raised, but in the love that had bound them, and in the legacy they would pass on to their son. As the years turned like the seasons, the tale of the pregnant widow and the millionaire cowboy became part of local legend, a story of stubborn hope, shared hardship, and the enduring power of partnership on the American frontier. And long after their footprints faded into dust, the Sullivan Ranch stood as testament to two lives once broken, made whole by courage, compassion, and the promise of tomorrow's dawn.